I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from returning guest Paul Pillar of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a 28-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency and author of Beyond the Water's Edge: How Partisanship Corrupts U.S. Foreign Policy. We'll be discussing his latest article for Responsible Statecraft entitled Trump's Use and Misuse of Iran Intel. It's an in-depth breakdown of what has transpired in the past month with the US, Israel, and Iran, and we'll be delving into the question of whether or not Iran's nuclear capabilities have truly been totally obliterated, as Trump put it, and there is reason for skepticism. This could lead to a lot of issues down the road. Let me tell you, that's the assessment that I'm getting from Paul Pillar in this conversation you're about to hear. This all could lead to Iran being more likely to seek nuclear weaponry as a deterrence. There's a lot to unpack, so let's get right to it with Paul Pillar. I want to welcome back to Parallax Views a guest that I really enjoy having on. He's written a book that I found very influential to myself in the past few years, Beyond the Water's Edge. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I'm talking about Paul L. Pillar. How are you doing?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. I get nervous in a way because I'm like, oh my God, I'm talking to someone that really has a great knowledge base. And I'm almost like intimidated by how great you are when it comes to your areas of expertise and intelligence. And I wanted to talk with you about a piece you wrote or that came out on July 1st, 2025, entitled Trump's Use and Misuse of Iran Intel. And there's a lot of directions we can go with this, but I think the place we should start is with what Trump has said about Iran's nuclear program hasn't always lined up with what his director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, has said and what others in his administration have said. How important do you think it is to really unpack that?
Well, I think it's important in ways that go beyond just the Iran nuclear issue. I mean, that's important enough, and we can get into the details of that. But more generally, to the extent that our foreign policy decision makers, including the president and his senior advisors, are not taking account of all of the best information and insight available to explain and to describe whatever is the foreign situation they're dealing with, whether it's Iran's nuclear program or something entirely different, then that's a prescription for policy making that is not well founded. Uh, the intelligence agencies are one source. I emphasize just one source of that information and insights. There are a lot of other bases for which our policymakers can which they can use to form an accurate picture of what's going on overseas. But if they're simply blown off, then that's, as I say, a prescription for bad policy making. In the case of the Iran nuclear program, I mean, we've got a couple of different dimensions here. The one to begin with is, to what extent was Iran, on the verge of developing a nuclear weapon, which is something that the Israeli prime minister has been asserting for some 30 years. And was, of course, the premise for the U.S. joining the Israeli military assault on Iran. But since 2003, in which there was an intelligence estimate, well, actually, it was a later intelligence estimate that said since 2003, Iran has not been working on a nuclear weapon. They've been doing um, uranium enrichment. They've had this nuclear program for many years, which goes back to the time of the Shah. But in terms of weaponizing it, there was no evidence that that was taking place really since 2003. And what Tulsi Gabbard had presented in her uh, congressional testimony that the president didn't like hearing was, I should emphasize, not her personal view, but rather the best judgment of the U.S. intelligence community, which includes the not just the CIA, but the Defense Intelligence Agency and the other components. And their judgment for quite some time now has been quite constant that Iran, despite all the other activity in terms of uranium enrichment and so on that have been closely followed, has not resumed any work on trying to build a nuclear weapon. And so far as we know, the supreme leader and the other Iranian decision makers had not decided to take that step. And that was the judgment that Mr. Trump did not like hearing because it undermined the whole basis for the U.S. intervention.
One aspect of your article that I found really interesting was this issue of cherry picking data. And in that, you reference the intel used for the Iraq weapons of mass destruction debacle. How would you compare today's cherry picking to what we saw in 2002 to 2003?
Well, I mean, it's the same sort of thing in terms of manipulating intelligence. And I might say you kindly referred to my most recent book, Beyond the Water's Edge. I had an earlier book called Intelligence and U.S. Foreign Policy, which goes into the whole Iraq experience in some detail, including what you're referring to with regard to the misuse of intelligence. Well, in the case of the Iraq War, a much larger war is from the U.S. point of view depended on that decision, and that's the whole history that began in March 2003 with thousands of U.S. casualties and all the other costs and consequences that we've seen over the last 2 decades. So, in terms of impact, uh, obviously it was a lot greater, but the basic technique that you're referring to was pretty much the same. I mean, what took place back then, when the Bush administration was selling the Iraq War, was a form of cherry picking that referred to two different issues. One, and this is actually the one that was less an administration manipulation of intelligence. That had to do with so-called weapons of mass destruction, where some of the intelligence community's own judgments turned out to be an error. But this did not stop the administration from going beyond those judgments and using some things that were, looked juicy to use with the public, even though the intelligence agencies didn't think they ought to be used at all. And the outstanding example of that was um, a couple of lines in President Bush's State of the Union address, in which he addressed this and used an unconfirmed report that came from the British about Iraq supposedly purchasing uranium ore in Africa. The U.S. intelligence analysts did not consider this a good report. The sourcing was not good. There were reasons to believe it just didn't exist. The main reason being that Iraq had its own supplies of uranium ore at the time. They didn't have to go to Mali or some other place to get it. And yet, despite repeated discouragement from George Tenet and others, the White House insisted on inserting this thing in the State of the Union address. So it was cherry picking a particular unconfirmed report. Where you had even more cherry picking in the Iraq war case had to do with the supposed alliance between the Iraqi regime and Al Qaeda. Here, the intelligence judgment was that no, there was no such alliance. But what the Bush administration did was to look for every little bit of scrap of evidence that might suggest that there was more of a relationship there than there really was. And so that was a form of cherry picking. Here, what we're dealing with regard to the Iran nuclear aspect, we've seen cherry picking in a couple of places, both of which I go into in the article that you mentioned. The Israeli government, in trying to coax the U.S. to get involved in direct military hostilities with Iran, has put out bits and pieces, scraps of intelligence that they contend suggest, well, maybe there's more here going on in terms of Iranian weaponization activity than the U.S. agencies have judged to be taking place. So it would be things like in this most recent couple of disclosures that the Israelis offered. Um, Little scraps like, well, that there was a military component that was informed about some things about the Iranian nuclear program that they hadn't been informed about before. Well, that's a long way from having any, firm evidence about Iran supposedly having decided to build a nuke. And there's no doubt, given the Israeli intelligence penetration of Iran, that they've got a lot more information on this whole subject, but they're only going to share the bits of it that suggest that maybe there's more going on here and that perhaps the Iranians have decided to build a weapon. All the other stuff they've collected that maybe points in a different direction, they're not sharing at all. Uh, and here, getting back to the U.S. administration, I think we've seen a bit of cherry picking with regard to that other intelligence question that has been much discussed since the U.S. attacks, and that is just how much damage did it do to the Iranian program? And so you've got people like Tulsi Gabbard and John Radcliffe, the CIA director, uh, after, a couple of days after the attacks, when doubts were already being raised about just how much destruction there was and about the Iranian ability to reconstruct the program, that they threw out a couple of more scraps of intelligence saying, well, we have reports saying that there were key facilities that were seriously damaged. Well, that may be entirely true, but that says nothing about other facilities that weren't damaged or other bits of intelligence that point in the direction of Iran being able to reconstitute the program. So cherry picking again.
I think that gets into a really interesting point. So, before the attack on Iran, Trump said, well, Tulsi Gabbard is wrong. This is a big threat. She's underestimating the threat in her assessment, in the intelligence community's assessment. And then after the attack, he says, well, we've completely obliterated, we've destroyed Iran's nuclear capabilities. But then the press reports a leaked preliminary assessment by the Defense Intelligence Agency saying, no, this probably only set back the Iranian program by maybe a few months. And Trump gets very upset with this and says, nope, it was total obliteration. So, in the first instance, Trump is accusing U.S. intelligence of underestimating a supposed threat. And then, as you point out, in the second instance, he was in effect accusing it of overestimating what was left of this threat after the U.S. attack. What does this mean, and how dangerous is this when it comes to the ways in which it may reduce credibility in both the administration and institutional trust?
Well, what it means is it's obviously not a case of the intelligence agencies being inveterate doves or inveterate hawks when the accusation, as you accurately described it, is that in one instance they're supposedly being uh, very Pollyannish about this Iranian nuclear threat, and then just less than a week later, The president is accusing them of overstating the threat. There have been past instances with different administrations and different issues where they have differed with the intelligence community on something. And most often it's been a consistent sort of accusation being leveled against the intelligence agencies that they're a bunch of lefty doves or something like that. Going back to even, say during the Reagan administration and some Republican administrations in general, we've had that were more keen on building up U.S. military capabilities, especially vis-a-vis the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And there were already efforts, and now I think going back to the Gerald Ford administration, to have alternative analyses that were based on the notion that the CIA and the DIA and the other intelligence agencies are underestimating the Soviet threat, and they're just not being hard-nosed about this. Well, here, I don't think that was an accurate accusation, but at least it was a consistent accusation. They were saying these people in these intelligence agencies are consistently being too Pollyannish about what the Soviets are up to. Well, here we have Mr. Trump making these two opposite accusations against the same bunch of intelligence agencies, all within the space of a week, which I think just on the face of it, obviously is not credible. It's what Mr. Trump was trying to leave as a message for the American public was, we had a serious threat and I took decisive action and I've eliminated the threat. That's what he'd like people to believe, even though the evidence certainly doesn't support that.
What are the implications of that? By which I mean, so if this leaked DIA assessment is correct and Trump is incorrect, I mean, this could come back to bite Trump. I mean, let's say in the next 3 years, Iran does get nuclear capabilities. I mean, how is he going to spin this? I mean, doesn't this doesn't this sort of cause problems potentially down the road?
I'm sure it's going to cause problems for Mr. Trump down the road. I mean, of course, this is a president who does not think in long-term terms. He thinks more of, what is going to sell well today and next week and this month and not much beyond that. But you're absolutely right. To the extent that there will be more indications in the months ahead of through leaked intelligence and just even just private sector perusal. We have private sector entities that use commercially available overhead imagery, for example, to reach their own conclusions, about what Iran may be doing at Fordow or Natanz or one of their other facilities. So we're going to have stories about this come out, and then people are going to confront Mr. Trump well, I thought you said this was all obliterated, and here it's not. So the pressure will be great, I think, on President Trump to do a reprise of the military attacks. And that pressure is also certainly going to come from the Israeli government, which has no compunction about repeated attacks against any of its adversaries, and that's going to include Iran.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think you even talked about how Israel Katz, the defense minister in Israel, was talking about an enforcement policy involving further attacks against Iran.
Yeah, there will be no hesitation on Israel's part to have further attacks. They no doubt consider from a strictly military operational point of view what they did um, last month was a big success. And it's certainly boosted the political standing inside Israel of Prime Minister Netanyahu. So this will, I'm sure, I'm almost certain we're going to see additional Israeli attacks of some sort in probably during the course of the year ahead. And this will again be coupled with probably pressure inside some of Mr. Trump's own political base on the American right that will be saying to him, "What are you doing about this continued Iranian military threat?" So you're right. He's put himself in somewhat of a bind, and I don't think he thought far enough in advance about this.
How important is it that we start thinking about how Iran views all of this. How does the Islamic Republic respond to this now? Because I'm pretty sure they're angry with the IAEA because they didn't, condemn the attacks. And then this just seems like it's going to be making it more difficult for a deal to be reached with Iran over the nuclear program, and it's going to make, as you point out, monitoring by international inspectors of the nuclear program much harder.
Yeah, there are several dimensions on this, all of which speak very pessimistically from a nuclear non-proliferation point of view. Yes, the relations between Iran and the international agency, the IAEA, that monitors these things is currently very bad. Um, it's partly because there was no formal condemnation, by the IAEA Board of Governors of the Israeli and U.S. attacks, which, to be consistent with the position of people like Mr. Grossi, the head of the IAEA, really should have been done because Grossi has said repeatedly, physical military attacks on nuclear facilities don't do any good. They only do harm, both in a physical way and also in a diplomatic way. And yet there was no condemnation by the same board of governors that just, less than a couple of weeks earlier had issued a resolution that was very critical of Iran with regard to some of their continuing um, inspection access requirements that go beyond the previous nuclear agreement, but have to do with their prior understandings with IAEA. And Iran, are also upset with the international agency because they have seen it to be a conduit, wittingly or unwittingly, of information that has assisted Israeli targeting. I mean, the IAEA, to be specific, has really insisted on speaking with, and they issue reports about, um, uh, particular officials in the Iranian nuclear program. And these are some of the same people who have been the subject of assassination operations by the Israelis, either clandestinely or most recently as part of the military attacks that were conducted. So there's a lot of resentment on Iran's part. They are in no hurry right now to restore the degree of access by international inspectors that existed before, and that under the 2015 nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was really intrusive in international monitoring. We've lost all that for now, and I can't overstate how much of a loss that is from an intelligence point of view, because no matter how much you rely on your unilateral sources, technical or human sources, or overhead imagery, there's no substitute in this business for on-the-ground inspection by the likes of the IAEA inspectors. So that's a big loss. Um, I mean, the other overriding question here in terms of Iranian reactions, well, two other questions. One, which you touched on, just the prospects for further negotiation. I think this most recent round of attacks has eliminated what any scrap of trust in Donald Trump remained in Iranian minds. I mean, there were several rounds of talks between Steve Witkoff and the Iranian negotiators that were aimed at getting to a new agreement. And while that's going on, then Israel conducts its large-scale attack, supported, of course, by the United States in terms of the weapons they're using. And then later on, a few days after that, Mr. Trump says, "Well, I'm going to think about this for a couple of weeks." And this was all cover, as the Iranians see it, for the attack by the United States, which took place just a couple of days after Trump talked about 2 weeks. So all of this raises understandable questions in the minds of the Iranians about, if we're going to negotiate again, what is this just all cover for another attack? And of course, the trust in Trump as a negotiating partner was already very low based on how he reneged on and totally abandoned the earlier agreement, the 2015 agreement, which once he came into office, uh, he abandoned in 2018, even though the Iranians were, according to the IAEA, totally living up to their obligations to limit their program under that agreement. But Trump decided to scrap it anyway. But then the big, really big question that we have to consider right now is to what extent all these attacks may have pushed Iranian decision makers over the line that they haven't stepped over yet, and that is to decide to build a nuclear weapon. Because, I mean, the simple fact is there is nothing that you can think of that will strengthen more the voices in Tehran that say we need a better deterrent than to be actually attacked by two other powers, both of which have their own nuclear weapons. And it's not just that experience, it's looking around at what's happened to other countries. Here's what's happened to Iran. Look what happened to Iraq, which did not have weapons of mass destruction, although Saddam Hussein was working on a nuclear weapon at the time. But he didn't have it, and so his country was invaded and his regime was overthrown. What about Libya, where Gaddafi gave up all of his unconventional weapons programs, and then when the opportunity arose during the Arab Spring to overthrow him, the United States and the Western governments joined in that effort, and Gaddafi wound up getting killed in a ditch. In contrast to that, you got North Korea, which does have nuclear weapons. And despite all of the awful things that North Korea does, they have not been attacked. And that regime has not been overthrown. And they haven't met the fate of Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein or any of those others who didn't have nuclear weapons. That is a very, very strong set of lessons that people in Iran are certainly looking at. And I think because of that, the chance of an Iranian nuclear weapon is certainly larger today than it was before these most recent attacks.
This is sort of a side note to all of that because I'm really curious. How important do you think it is that not just the public, but also I would say policymakers think in terms of how Iran perceives the US? What I mean by that is I think there's the narrative we often hear of the mad mullahs, and it ignores the possibility that Iran actually acts pretty rationally and is interested in creating a deterrence. How important do you think it is that we understand Iran has sort of its own interests and it will react based on what those interests are?
Well, it's very important if you're going to have sound policy for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. You need, an accurate and insightful picture of what you're dealing with and whom you're dealing with. And you're absolutely right. In the case of Iran, this whole process has been badly plagued by the stereotype of mad mullahs and so on. And yes, the overall conduct of the Islamic Republic's foreign policy has certainly reflected a lot of caution and rationality. I mean, we saw some of this with the supposed reprisal for the U.S. attacks, which was this minor attack on the base in Qatar, which was carefully calibrated, telegraphed in advance, intentionally designed to send the message that yes, we can retaliate and we can reach U.S. assets on the other side of the Gulf, but we do not want to escalate the situation. So we've carefully designed this so that there wouldn't be U.S. casualties, and Mr. Trump can call an end to it. So, I mean, that's certainly not the kind of thing a bunch of mad mullahs would do. And overall, I think if you look at Iranian foreign policy in general, quite contrary to the common view that, well, Iran is the prime source and the original source of all kinds of evil and instability in the Middle East, Iranian policy toward the region has been overwhelmingly reactive. When somebody does something to them, they react. If somebody creates a situation that stirs things up, the Iranians are going to respond to that, but even though they didn't create it. And there are just countless examples of that. I mean, the Iranian actions that they've taken or attempted to take against Israel have uniformly been in direct response to something Israel has done to Iran, whether it's clandestine assassinations or overt military attacks. It's always Israel has done something and Iran has responded or has tried to respond. The same thing with other situations. The horrible Iran-Iraq War, one of the most deadly, destabilizing things that the Middle East has seen in the post-war years, over the last few decades. that was started by Saddam Hussein with an attack in 1980, and the Iranians responded. They responded quite vigorously at great cost, but they didn't want that war. They didn't start the war. And then with regard to the Iranian support to the so-called proxies, which I would discard that term because we're talking about governments and elements that have their own motivations and interests. But take like the Houthi regime in Yemen. Yeah, they get some Iranian support, but this wasn't some situation that the Iranians created. It was a local rebellion that succeeded in taking over, most of the country. A rebellion based on very local issues with northern tribes in Yemen. And then the Saudis got involved in a very big way with a multi-year aerial assault that was devastating, that until we had this situation in Gaza arising over the last 2 years, was the biggest humanitarian problem in all of the Middle East. Well, the Iranians reacted to that too. They never got involved in anything close to the way the Saudis did. But given that it became a quagmire for the Saudis, who were seen as a regional rival, the Iranians were happy to provide, some arms to the Houthis and make their cross Gulf rivals bleed a little bit. Likewise, with any support for Iran to, say, Hamas or other Palestinian groups, the Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation and subjugation would be there anyway. It's been there for decades under not just Hamas, but a whole alphabet soup of other, Palestinian resistance groups. The Iranians respond to this because this is a big salient issue in the Middle East. For them to provide diplomatic support and propaganda support and even some material support to these groups is one way for trying to win friends and influence people among the Arab population throughout the Middle East. Again, they didn't start it all. This is all based on what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And we don't realize any of this. Instead, it's for the public as well as for many policymakers. This all seems to be forgotten, and instead we have that stereotyped image of the mad mullahs who are intent on destabilizing the region.
Just a few more questions here. I was wondering if you could go over two of the historical references you make in the article, namely Bhutto's "eat grass" quote and Saddam's post-1981 nuclear acceleration, because I may have younger listeners that are unfamiliar with those examples. Why are those historical references important to remember now?
I made those references to reinforce the point that when you're talking about the possible reconstitution of a nuclear program and possibly using it to build weapons, which as we just discussed, is a big issue right now with regard to Iran, you have to take into account what is the degree of determination and the priority that is being given to that kind of effort by whatever regime you're talking about. And I have no doubt that if these most recent attacks did influence Iranian decision makers to cross that line and finally decide what they had never decided to do before, which was to actually build a nuclear weapon, they will no doubt devote a lot of priority to that because they consider their existence dependent on it. Well, we've seen the same sort of thing in the case of Pakistan, and this goes back to the 1970s. Pakistan has always seen, India, their bigger neighbor, as an existential threat, which has a far bigger conventional force, one that is capable of slicing Pakistan in two in short order. So there was a very, very high priority placed by Pakistani decision makers, not just Mr. Bhutto, but others, on developing a nuclear deterrent as a way to defend themselves against India. Very high priority, and so the idea of we'll eat grass if necessary to do it. And then the other example was Iraq, which really does illustrates two things. One, and we should go back to the event in question was a previous Israeli attack, which was in 1981. The Israeli Air Force bombed an Iraqi nuclear reactor at a place called Osirak. And this was at the time was hailed by, including the Reagan administration here in the United States, as a supposed victory for nuclear nonproliferation. Well, in fact, as scholars have examined this afterwards, what Iraq was doing at the time was not much. It was a moribund or semi-moribund nuclear program that didn't seem to be going anywhere. The reaction by the Saddam Hussein regime to the Israeli attack was to decide to build a bomb and to place high priority on the program. They switched from a plutonium route to an enriched uranium route. They had a clandestine enrichment program, which we finally saw the likes of with the next Middle East war 10 years later, that got quite advanced and was brought Iraq far, far closer to a nuclear weapon than they ever were when the Israelis bombed the reactor. So that illustrates two things. One, how these military attacks, supposedly in the name of setting back a nuclear program, can be highly counterproductive. It certainly was counterproductive in the case of Iraq. And it also illustrates the point that you raised, that when a regime is really determined to do something like accelerate a nuclear program with a nuclear weapon in mind, they can do an awful lot despite sanctions, despite previous attacks, and all the other hurdles they may face.
I hope this isn't too outside the scope of the article, but I found it really interesting recently. I was perusing The Atlantic, and there was an article by Robert Kagan entitled American Democracy Might Not Survive a War with Iran. And he says there that Iran doesn't pose a threat to the US, so getting into a war with them is crazy. And he also thinks that this is going to lead, a war with Iran would lead Trump to sort of bring more dictatorial powers back home. And I thought it was interesting to run that by you because I know you've been critical of neocons, and now we have one of the arch neocons, Kagan, sort of agreeing with some of the pro-restraint people. What do you make of that? I mean, it seems like across the board, there's a lot of people saying that what Trump has done with Iran is kind of crazy, and it could have domestic consequences.
Well, I agree with Kagan on a couple of scores on with regard to this topic. One, yeah, Iran is not a big threat to the United States. It really isn't a threat to the United States at all. Here we've got this sort of mid-level Middle Eastern state that's an ocean and a half away. It doesn't have weapons that are going to reach our homeland. Um, it's repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to use negotiation to try to reach agreements with us, peaceful agreements. To consider it a threat on a level with what the Soviet Union was during the Cold War, or how many people regard China today, or even North Korea, which of course does have nuclear weapons and has long-range missiles that now can reach part of the United States. Iran isn't anything like that. And to put it on the same sort of scale as some of the real threats that the United States has faced in the past is a big mistake. With regard to the internal effects, I think Kagan's right about that too. And it's not just here in the United States, but it's a much repeated historical pattern that wars and military engagements against foreign enemies have been the occasion and the rationale and excuse by many regimes in many cases to assume authoritarian powers. It's the whole idea of taking a rally around the flag effect and carrying it to extremes. That we can't put up with any kind of domestic opposition or division since we're engaged in this existential battle against a foreign threat. And I have no doubt that we would see steps by Mr. Trump in that direction if we had a bigger war with Iran. And of course, part of the background of that are all the authoritarian steps that he's taken just in the first half year of his second term. I would add to that with regard to the current situation in Iran. I mean, we've seen that taking place in Israel, where Netanyahu's government has done a lot of things that have departed from democracy, even for the Jewish Israeli majority, having to do with trying to manipulate the court system and so on and so forth. And he has seen basically endless war, whether it's against the Palestinians in Gaza or against the Iranians, as one way of sustaining his public support and providing a rationale for many of the things that he's doing domestically. So whether it's Israel or the United States or other countries we can cite in history, yes, that's a very common pattern, and I think Kagan's concern is very well founded.
One of the most interesting aspects of your article is the way in which you deal with this matter of intentions versus capabilities when it comes to nuclear programs. Why is it important for the public to think about that distinction?
Uh, because we've narrowed the public dialogue too much on strictly capabilities. And so we've got lots of discussion right now, or since the U.S. attacks, about exactly how much damage was done to Fordow and that sort of thing. Now, yes, that's very important, but overlooked in all of that is what I referred to before of the big question: would Iran decide to build a nuclear weapon? And all the indications are, as in that intelligence community judgment that Ms. Gabbard had conveyed, which we referred to at the beginning of this discussion, they had not done so, at least prior to these most recent Israeli and U.S. attacks. But the danger is that the attacks themselves are going to lead them to take that decision. Um, you've got lots of countries elsewhere too that have nuclear programs, including ones that in which they do their own uranium enrichment, but they have not decided to build a nuclear weapon, probably wisely for various reasons. And some of those countries, if they did decide to build a nuclear weapon, that would be a big new concern for U.S. foreign policy makers. So we dwell on capabilities, but with regard to the problem of nuclear proliferation, intentions matter just as much. Unfortunately, they get overlooked, and especially what gets overlooked is what the impact of an armed attack can have on the decision making and the intentions of the targeted country.
In other words, like we've been saying, it could uh, make officials within Iran say, "Well, we need to build a nuke now."
Absolutely. That I think is ultimately the probably the biggest cost of the events that we've seen over the past month.
I just had two more questions. I feel like I haven't talked about Israel enough of this conversation. How important is it for us to include Israel in conversations about this? Is there an issue with the U.S.-Israel special relationship? Are we relying too much on Israeli intelligence and not questioning where Israeli intelligence may be cherry picking? Can you unpack that for us?
Well, a number of dimensions there. In terms of the intelligence, yeah, I see columnists writing about, there was a report about, the latest scrap of information that the Israelis have offered and suggesting that this means that the Iranians may have already decided to build a nuclear weapon and just kind of taking it at face value without taking into account the very strong Israeli governmental motivation to get the U.S. involved in a war with Iran. I mean, that's been a Netanyahu objective for decades. And so naturally, they're going to, shape their sharing of the intelligence product with that in mind, and it is going to involve a lot of cherry picking. There's no question that U.S. and Israeli objectives on the issues we've talked about diverge considerably. There are Israeli objectives that have to do with keeping a regional rival weak and divided and loathed. Um, there are Israeli objectives, especially on Mr. Netanyahu's part, about continuing to portray Iran as a grave threat in a way that diverts international attention from anything the Israelis themselves are doing in places like Gaza. Uh, and they certainly do not want to see the United States have any kind of rapprochement or ordinary diplomatic business with Iran, which is why the Israelis have done everything they can to sabotage U.S.-Iranian diplomacy. With this most recent round of attacks being, a glaring example of that. That was one of the major objectives, was to completely derail what looked like it might be a promising diplomatic track that could lead the Trump administration and Iran to some kind of new nuclear agreement. That's something that Netanyahu and his government did not want at all, and that's something that the attack, as we discussed earlier, has in fact, at least for now, derailed. All of those are dimensions that need to be taken into account in U.S. policymaking, and unfortunately aren't always taken into account.
So I've kept you all ready for around 40 minutes here. The last question I had for you is I guess there's two parts to it, but I'll mix it into one big question. What are the broader implications when it comes to issues like threat inflation in U.S. foreign policy circles and the politicization of intelligence? What do you see as the broader implications for those two things moving forward?
Well, the broader implications involve number one, as I alluded to earlier, foreign policy decision making is simply going to be bad when the output of the intelligence agencies is either ignored or is picked apart for politicization reasons. And secondly, and on the threat exaggeration side of things, um, you're going to have more and more involvement, costly involvement in overseas military adventures than you otherwise would. We see, threat inflation has been driven uh, historically by a couple of different things. One is kind of just human nature in terms of what gets our attention, and secondly is the motivations of political leaders knowing that their support is more likely to be sustained if they are leading a national effort against some foreign enemy. I mean, just look at the poll numbers of George W. Bush before and after the invasion of Iraq. After 9/11, his poll numbers skyrocketed, and to keep them up there, he needed something more than just a metaphorical war on terror. He needed, more of a real physical war. And in the first few months, at least, that's what the Iraq War did for him until that became a quagmire and it dragged on, and his poll numbers sank lower and lower, over the rest of his presidency. Um, where that's a long-standing historical pattern. Earlier in the book that you referenced about uh, partisanship in U.S. foreign policy, I go way back to the beginning of the Republic and talk about some ways in which partisanship has infected U.S. foreign policy in earlier times. And I would go so far as to say that the wars of the 19th century that the U.S. fought against Britain in 1812, against Mexico in 1844, and against Spain in 1898, I think I can make an argument that probably none of those would have been fought if you could extract the partisanship element. Uh, and in most cases, it was a matter of the two parties each being concerned that they're going to get um, you know that they're going to be outdone by their opposition in posing as forthright patriots that need to stand up to a foreign threat. If you didn't have that partisan motivation, we might not have been involved in any of those three wars.
I was just going to add to that, and I know I said last question, but do you think the way Trump is handling this may also affect Democrats in the sense of, I mean, we see figures like Hakeem Jeffries saying, the big threat is Iran, the big threat is Iran. It seems like both parties are sort of coalescing on Iran as the big threat now. Do you think that sort of hardens this mentality?
Yeah, yes, it does. And I think the calculations of Democratic Party leadership are going to include such considerations as, okay, we need to go against Trump, very forcefully on, things like taxes and Medicaid and so on, and these domestic issues. But, in order to retain our credibility, we have to make sure we're seen by the American public as standing tall against our foreign adversaries. And Iran is going to be in the public mind, at or near the top of that list. So you're absolutely right. This is something that rebounds from one party to the other, regardless of which one is in power. But they both tend to play this game.
I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views. I mean, I can't express how grateful I am to have you as a source of knowledge on this show. This has been, I think, your third or fourth appearance here, and it really means a great deal to both me and my audience. I want to thank you again.
Okay, you're welcome.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Darko, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mark M, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y, Kellerman, Saded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.